This is my favourite bit about standing in for Mike. I get to talk to Peter Hitchens from the Mail on Sunday, who's in the studio. Good morning, Peter.
Morning, Cohen.
Well, first of all, we need to talk about Russia because, of course, you were a foreign correspondent based in Moscow, and you were there in 1991 when there was an attempted coup against Mikhail Gorbachev, the then president. Well, first of all, run us through what that was like, because you pointed out in the Mail on Sunday that there was a sort of sense of excitement on Saturday that Putin would be overturned and that Russia would implode, but that was not necessarily an exciting prospect.
Be careful what you wish for.
Yeah.
And the Russian Civil War in the 1920s, after the Bolshevik coup d'etat, was a horrendous thing, in which brothers' wars are particularly bad because people have to shed more inhibitions to fight their own countrymen than they do to fight other people. And so they stripped down to absolute savagery. And if you look at the records of what happened during that civil war, the horrible cruelty, mass murder, disembowelings, mutilations, and utter bottomless horror, it makes the flesh crawl. And this happened to a country which, 20 years before, had been largely at peace and actually marching quite rapidly towards a prosperous civilization. And suddenly it was worse than medieval times. And so a lot of Russians are very afraid of that happening again. And there were still people living who recalled it and what followed it when I was there in 1991. But on the other hand, it looks as if it might happen. I woke up in the morning. I'd come back from the Crimea. I'd been on an assignment down the Crimea and had picked up on the radio some rumours that there might be a putsch. Gorbachev's great friend Alexander Yakovlev had been saying in public he thought one was looming, and Yakovlev was one of the cleverest men in Russia at the time. And I thought, in that case, I'll get on the first flight back to Moscow. And there was a very strange atmosphere in Moscow when I got home that Sunday evening. And the following morning I woke up, and in that sort of strange half awake, half asleep way you are when you wake up, I switched on the radio, and they were saying that Gorbachev had been removed on the grounds of ill health. And for at least 2 seconds I believed this, and I suddenly this is exactly, any minute now they'll be saying, go quietly to your homes. This is exactly what it sounds like. I know you see it in films, you read about it in books, but here I was actually in a city where there was a coup d'etat in progress. I went downstairs to my block, a beautiful Stalinist block full of Communist Party Central Committee apparatchiks and KGB pensioners. Went down to the street, great big street, Kutuzovsky Prospekt, which runs from right to the west of Moscow to the Kremlin, and down the street out of the west were coming tanks with their barrels of tanks. Actual, full
What
scale.
did you think at that point? You thought,
I thought, crikey, here. I mean, it was like slightly being in a dream. Is this actually happening? And am I standing here? Well, and the Russians around me saying, they were all dismayed as I was. They didn't know what to do or what to think. I got into my car and I drove around Moscow for much of the day trying to find out what was going on. It was filling up with military vehicles, and again, crowds of questioning people are often going up to the soldiers and say, what is it that you're doing? And then it began to fall apart, and it did. Very much slightly less quickly as the Prigozhin thing fell apart. The coup leaders gave a press conference in which they appeared to be either nervous or drunk, and their authority began to fade. And then, I think it was the night after, I was out near what was then called the Russian White House, the headquarters of the Russian government, and near a big underpass in a ring road in Moscow. It was dark. I think it had been raining as well. It was a dismal night for August, and because it was the end of August. And then there was shooting. And I'd always been told that if you hear a shot which finds its mark in a human body, it sounds different. And I always thought it was superstitious, but I have to say those shots sounded as if they were, and 3 people died. It was very confused. But the thing was, at that moment, I thought, is this going to be a massacre? Is it going to be Tiananmen Square? Or what? And then it stopped. And a lot of people have said since that was the moment at which both sides pulled back, because both sides couldn't face the idea of beginning another civil war, and the coup collapsed, and some sort of order was re-established, and then the whole of communist rule collapsed, which was, to me, what I'd gone there to see. I'd longed for the Soviet Union to collapse, and I'd longed for communism to collapse. I remember being so exhilarated, because all all the litter bins were full of red and gold Communist Party membership cards, which people had chucked in and set fire to. There's some smoke curling up out of them. It was the end of the Communist Party.
I was never in the Communist. I was not a Communist.
No, it was overfull. They didn't need this thing anymore to rise in their career. It wasn't necessary. It was a huge psychological moment. I've always thought it was one of the most telling things I ever saw, these bins full of it. And I was so exhilarated. I remember driving through Moscow rather faster than I should have been because the traffic police had gone into hiding, with my windows rolled down, singing hymns. It was just absolutely overjoyed. I thought, at last, this filthy, horrible tyranny has come to an end. It won't come back. But the thing was, it was very nearly something very horrible and extremely frightening, and you couldn't tell. And you can't, in my view, you can't live among people in somebody else's country for 2.5 years without forming an affection for them. And I'm stuck with this the rest of my life. I quite like Russians as people. I don't like the government. I don't like their leader. I don't like the way the country is run. But Russians themselves, and you have to sympathise with them and think, I don't want them to be plunged into a civil war. There's been enough murder and warfare in that place to last for several centuries, and they could do with a break from it.
From what you're saying, I think there are parallels to be drawn with what happened at the weekend.
Some, not many.
Because I think Prigozhin was stunned at the rapidity of his advance. I don't think he expected to be able to get so far towards Moscow, and I think when he was in sight of Moscow, I say in sight, it was about 120 miles. I think the enormity of what was ahead began to dawn on him. Also, of course, Putin extremely worried about the optics of having the Wagner group march into the capital city. So all round,
can I just make a small point about all this? What were we relying on for our knowledge about these events?
I don't know. I was on air just watching it happen.
The BBC have a really great reporter in Moscow, Steve Rosenberg, who I admire greatly, but he was stuck in Moscow. He didn't know anything about it. All we had was second-hand stuff off social media saying this, that, and the other. We have no idea how many troops Prigozhin had or where they got to. It's all conjecture, and I don't know. I think for me, the crucial thing was this: if Prigozhin, who by himself, simply from the size of his mercenary outfit, which is largely composed of ex-prisoners, not particularly well trained, if by himself he couldn't probably have captured McDonald's, but it's only if the large numbers of actual soldiers defected his side that he would have been a menace, and that would be where it would have been. That would be what Putin would have been really scared of. Now, we've seen these scenes from Rostov of the crowds applauding the Prigozhin people, which is bad news for Putin, but I still don't know what the extent of it was. In fact, I counsel a great deal of caution in anybody trying to work out what's going on. I was in Moscow in 1991, and I still cannot fully work out what happened during those 3 days, what it was about, who was on which side really, how much Gorbachev knew, what Yeltsin was up to. It's all still, despite many books having been written about it, something of a mystery what actually happened, and this is even more of one. Be careful not to load it down with too much speculation without more knowledge.
What's your interpretation of what happened? Because, as I say, I was on air and we were monitoring these fast-moving events, and it looked for all the world as if they were going to march into Moscow. Machine gun posts were being set up around the Kremlin, and then all of a sudden there's a deal. There's a deal.
I don't know. I don't know what Prigozhin was playing at in the first place. I don't know why Putin put up with... There've been weeks of Prigozhin insulting him and taunting him.
Well,
he seemed to be the only person in Russia who had freedom of speech, which is a bizarre thing. Why was he allowed so much leeway for so long? A lot of Putin's allies, as I understand it, because I did ask a few people who know more about current Moscow than I do over the weekend, a lot of Putin's allies were dismayed. They said, why didn't he act? Remember, when he took on the oligarch Khodorkovsky, do you remember that? He was the guy who ran, I think, was Yukos, the big oil company. He didn't agree to Putin's telling him that he had to accept his political authority. So he was arrested at gunpoint by special forces at an airport and seized and thrown into the slammer. And there was no doubt in anybody's mind after that Putin was in charge. But nothing happened to Prigozhin. So that long period of weakness, I would suspect, in any power structure, would do more damage to Putin than any other thing. The fact that he didn't decisively act against a challenge, that always weakens people.
And what is it about Russia? Someone who said that in Russia nothing is true. But it's worse than you think. and anything could happen.
Well, these things, it's very hard to find out what's going on. It is a very secretive society,
Right.
and people are naturally secretive. But here's a simple metaphor for the whole thing. The Russian word for safety is bezopasnost, which actually is a negative word. Bez means without. Bezopasnost means without danger. As far as they're concerned, the default position in Russia is danger. And safety is a temporary thing which has to be attained and worked for. Nobody feels safe, and that's always justified very, very strong states and repressive governments who claim, by being strong, to be able to protect the people. It's an army and a secret police force with a country, rather than a country with an army and a secret police force. And that's the way round. You have to understand it. It is a place of fear. It is a place of secrecy. It's not like here, but that doesn't mean we can dismiss its people as being writable off or not important or not worry about them.
Well, you said earlier that after your period of living in Russia that you formed a great affection for the Russian people.
Well, I made friends there. I mean, they became like people.
Given that you like the Russian people, how will they be reacting to what's happened? How will they see?
Look, there are many different kinds of Russian people.
What do you like about Russian people?
What I liked about them was that when you got to know them, there was a great depth of friendship. The initial response, they haven't had smile inflation in Russia. People don't smile that readily. They don't trust you initially, but when they do, when you get to sit in their kitchens late at night, drinking the vodka and eating the black bread and the smoked fish, that's when you get to know people and trust is there. They are very stoical. And the British people used to be stoical, and it's a quality I admire, and they have to be, and they're very, very funny. Bad countries have the best jokes. There's no question of it.
Let's remind ourselves of the US Secretary of State, the American Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, basically revealing the United States' reaction to the events of the weekend.
So I think this is clearly, we see cracks emerging. Where they go, if anywhere. When they get there, very hard to say. I don't want to speculate on it, but I don't think we've seen the final act. This has been a devastating strategic failure for Putin across virtually every front, economic, military, geopolitical standing.
So Blinken there talking about cracks in the Russian facade. I mean, the international community must be looking at Putin and thinking this is a weakened president. How do you think America, Britain, the West will react going forward?
I don't know, but I think they have to be careful what they wish for. There seems to be some kind of belief that if Putin falls, he'll be replaced by Andy Pandy or Goldilocks. This will not happen. Whoever replaces him may well be considerably worse, and this is the problem. The old devil you know formula. There are many devils in Russia, and we've seen, I look at the face of Prigozhin, this foul-mouthed, contorted, violent ex-criminal who's risen close to the top of Russian society. He's not the only person like that. Russia, after 70 years of communism, was full of deeply immoral and violent and unpleasant people who were the products of an evil system. And an awful lot of people of that kind are around. If you don't mind risking having someone like that in charge of a nuclear button, then okay, that's your decision. But I think people need to be very careful to know. Remember the Arab Spring? We were all told this. Everyone was cheering it on, saying how great all these revolts were overthrowing. And in many cases, the governments which resulted from the Arab Spring were worse than what they had before. But fortunately, none of them had nuclear weapons. In this case, it is a nuclear weapon state. And it's by no means clear that if Putin goes, he would be replaced by somebody better. I don't know why people don't think about this more. It's the same with the war. If the war with Ukraine is actually pursued to the point of the defeat of Russia, then what do people think will happen? Do you think that in Moscow a defeat will be greeted with people saying, right, let's ask Nick Clegg to come and take over the government? I don't think you'll find that will be the response at all.
So the vacuum that could be created by the absence or the departure of Putin could be more dangerous than Putin.
I think most undoubtedly. I know I don't think there's anyone living in the West who actually knows who would take over. I pretty much guarantee that whoever did take over would be a complete surprise to us, and we would simply not know what we were dealing with. So again, it's not. There's a ludicrous. Putin has many faults, and I've been writing about his tyranny and his suppression of free speech, and democracy for many years, and there's no question of this. But the idea that he is a new Hitler and all this ridiculous, or that he's sort of Sauron in Lord of the Rings, is an absurd propaganda exaggeration. I think it would be wiser for us to assume that we're better off with him than any known alternative, unless we have a very good idea of who's going to replace him. So this sort of exaltation seems to me to be, well, pointless, really. What do people think will happen? This isn't. This isn't Tunisia or even Egypt. It's a huge country in a very important strategic position, with a still functioning and very large arsenal of nuclear weapons. And the reason why nuclear weapons haven't been frightening for so long is that, by and large, the people in charge of them have been rational. Well, would you want this Prigozhin rational? Is there anything we've seen in his behaviour which suggests
he doesn't look that rational?
He doesn't look that rational to me. Well, that's the kind of area from which you might get a new leader. Russian nationalism, which he speaks for, is a very powerful political force in Moscow. It's one Putin always has to reckon with, and drives him in some ways towards things which he probably otherwise wouldn't do. And it's there, and Russian defeat and Russian chaos will I think you'll find, will fan Russian nationalism.
Well, thank you very much for fascinating insight into that fast-developing situation over there in Russia. No matter what you say, you're an expert on the subject. And now, let's talk about something unusual. You've just got out of prison, haven't you? Tell me all about it.
Well, I spent last week in Shrewsbury prison. I can't tell you all about it because
for a TV show.
Yeah, it was for TV, but it's not some kind of jokey "I'm a celebrity, get me out of here" TV show. The idea, which
it's called Banged Up, isn't it?
Yes, at the moment that's the working title. I think that's what it's going to be called. But you know.
So tell us about what the programme is.
Well, the whole idea was that they would try to replicate as closely as possible the real experience of prison. It would be impossible to do the thing in its full unpleasantness, because first of all, nobody like me would volunteer for it, and secondly, I think it would be almost impossible to make it sufficiently safe for anyone to be prepared to do it. One of the because there are a number of people taking part. There are about 30 former prisoners with considerable experience of British prisons. There was a former prison governor with great experience of running prisons, and a group of former prison officers as well. Some men, some women, I should say.
Then yourself and some celebrities.
And then myself and some other so-called celebrities, and we were invited to take part, and we were, as it were, put in the midst of a much greater number of former prisoners. And therefore,
they gave you the real experience.
Well, the whole idea was, Nick, it was presented to me very seriously. What they followed the law and the prison rules as they would be followed as closely as they possibly could. We lived in conditions. We ate the food. We slept on the beds. We were banged up in the cells for the prescripted hours. We wore the clothes. We had the showers or didn't have them. We mopped the floor and peeled the potatoes and doled out food in the servery, and went to the various therapy sessions and all the rest of it, which would happen in real life. I even went to a gym for the first time in my life.
So prison's good for you, you see.
I have to say that as a diet, it was very effective. I lost 3 pounds.
Well, because the food was so horrible.
No, because it's so horrible. Actually, I mean, I managed to make it work for me. There's a lot of chips.
Okay.
Actually, this is the chips. This is the chips and sliced white bread diet.
But you were in the gym and you were doing yoga, I hear.
There was yoga, but that was the real. That was in many ways the worst of it.
That's what you said. The worst aspect was the yoga.
I can't stand yoga. But
tell us, what's the jail experience? Let's give them the benefit of the doubt. I think they've gone to the trouble of recreating the experience fairly genuinely of what it's like to be in jail. So, how was it?
Dismal. Often frightening. On the second, when I woke up for the second morning in the cell, I felt really, really down. There was at least one occasion when I came close to a sort of meltdown from the oppression. It is a pressure cooker. And the architecture of prison is very powerful, and it presses down on you. It makes you feel powerless. You go through these experiences of becoming a person who's not trusted. You have to be searched when you go in, and I mean searched. You have to be locked away, even inside the prison, so that you're not left.
So does your dignity fall?
Your dignity is completely gone. And I was wearing these disgusting sort of tracky bottoms and all the rest of it, which were actually stained. I can't. There's a lot of detail I'm saving up for near at the time. So but it was the actual process of going in, because I turned up in a suit and tie and polished shoes and was transformed into this shuffling,
into a lag.
In sort of 40 minutes of pretty humiliating induction, and I'd agreed in advance. The whole point, it's not playing a part exactly; it's participating in some ways quite an interesting social experiment. You couldn't. People like me, unless we did something criminal or stupid, which of course none of us is necessarily spared from. There are miscarriages of justice in this country, and often people who think they're safe get into terrible trouble as a result of traffic offences too, and find themselves suddenly in a place they would never dream of. I would have thought for most people of my class background, the greatest danger of fetching up in prison is perhaps killing somebody on the road. But it can happen, and suddenly you're pitched into this inferno, a world you can't understand. People speak a language you don't fully understand. They have rules of how to behave you don't understand. It was often quite frightening, and not in a phony way. And I'd say dispiriting, and there was this strong feeling of pressure. I hated it. But at the same time, I found it exhilarating and extremely educational. I don't at all regret having done it, but I'm glad it's over, I have to tell you. And someone wrote in to the Mail Online website saying, "Oh, I've been to France for the holiday, so I'm French." I'm not making that claim. I don't I've had anything like the full experience of being a convicted person in prison, but I have had enough of a taste of it, I think, to understand the whole thing a lot better than someone who hasn't. I don't think anybody would have envied me those days if they'd suddenly had to undergo them.
I wish we could talk about this for a lot longer.
Too,
I'm going to have to ask you a final question. Having experienced that, do you think the prison system is acceptable? Does it work?
But I've always thought it stank. I think I am a law and order person, and I believe very strongly in the punishment and deterrence of crime. But I don't think that permits the squalor and the violence and the chaos of our prisons. I don't think they're frightening in utterly the wrong way.
And a very last question: if that had been a real sentence, you talked about even in these television conditions, after a couple of days, you felt pretty low. You felt despair. How would you have felt if you were, for some reason, you'd got 5 years and you were genuinely there?
The same thing, only about 1 million times more intense. I'm completely unsurprised at the horrible level of suicide in our prisons. And after that experience, even less so. It is one of the great unexamined scandals of modern times. The number of people who take their own lives in prison. It's shocking. It's barely known about, but we say we have no death penalty anymore, but actually, to a great extent, people confronted with that are effectively dead. It's very, very. It's a big social problem, but it's another measure of how much less good, how much less civilized, how much less prosperous, how much less well-governed a country we are than we like to pretend.
Extraordinary. Listen, that was an amazing half an hour. Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you very much.
Peter Hitchens, Mail on Sunday columnist.